Black Myth Wukong was a phenomenon. This UE5-powered action epic sold millions of copies when it launched earlier this year, impressing with its fast gameplay and sophisticated visuals. But its configuration on PS5 left something to be desired, employing bizarre framerate locks and frame gen with a 30 FPS base frame rate. Developer Game Science has addressed at least some of those issues as of the latest patch, and they've also added PS5 Pro support, using PSSR to improve the image quality for Pro players. So is PS5 finally in reasonable shape, and should we expect any issues from the Pro upgrade? Let's start by taking a quick look at the patched PS5 code. The most obvious superficial change here is that the PS5 has a sharpening slider now. With no sharpening applied, the image looks pretty soft but relatively free of aliased edges. Dialing it up to 5, which is the default, gives the image a look that is pretty typical for lower-res current-gen console titles. 10 provides maximum crispiness for players who want to max out on local contrast. Compared to the launch code, a value of about 7 matches the base PS5 in its performance configuration, though I've dialed it to 5 for the rest of my PS5 comparisons to best represent the default experience. Outside of the sharpness tweak, the most obvious visual change is that the game's Lumen GI presentation has been altered slightly. There's more obvious occlusion present in certain parts of the game world essentially. The shadow maps sometimes appear slightly different as well. The other modes also have some GI differences relative to the launch code, although they are affected less obviously. Other visual settings appear similar, at least in my tests. That includes resolution, which remains at 1080p internally, with no apparent upsampling to a higher output resolution. Frame gen is unfortunately still a reality here, and performance is generally similar in my tests as well, usually holding 60 FPS fairly well. The game's intro runs with frame gen disabled and mostly hangs in the 40s and 50s, and there are some occasional dips during other segments as well. I suspect the game may be disabling frame gen during especially sudden changes in camera position, which is likely the source of some of these dips. It's not a great fit for a fast action game running at only 60 FPS, and it's likely not even necessary for 60 FPS gameplay for the most part, as Rich demonstrated in some tests a few months ago. Lean more heavily on FSR or TSR, and a reasonable 60 FPS experience should be achievable, even on the PS5's CPU and GPU. Performance mode is pretty similar then, but the other two modes differ more dramatically. The quality mode takes a pretty obvious hit to image quality, with less definition and detail in foliage and fine geometry. It's a substantial loss relative to the earlier code. A quick pixel count reveals the issue. The quality mode appears to be rendering at 1080p here, down from roughly 1440p on average before. The old quality mode was upsampling to 4K, while the new quality mode looks more like 1440p or perhaps 1620p. Other visual settings do seem to have been bumped up though. Shadows are obviously higher res and have less aggressive cascades, and the draw distance for foliage has been improved somewhat. Essentially, you're trading a higher resolution in the launch version for better visual settings in the current version. Frame rates are improved over the base game, at least in a sense. The original quality mode ran with an unstable frame rate, often running in the low to mid 30s. Now the quality mode has a more sensible, straight 30 FPS cap, producing an evenly frame-paced experience without dips. Balance mode gets a very different visual treatment though. The new image obviously has more detail, and finer geometric lines managed to present without artifacting. A pixel count reveals a similar setup to quality mode, a 1080p internal resolution with a subjectively 1440p-like output. Performance-wise, it spends most of its time at or close to 45 FPS, which is the default framerate cap in this mode. That means a pretty unsteady procession of frames at 60Hz output, with a mix of 16 and 33 millisecond frames in typical play. But new in this patch is an alternative version of the balance mode. With the PS5 set to automatically enable 120Hz output, the balance mode now aims for a flat 40 FPS reading, with each frame essentially tripled to evenly fit a 120Hz refresh. In my experience, this actually holds a pretty stable 40 FPS, with relatively small and rare dips. This small change makes this mode highly useful in my opinion. The other modes can also run at 120Hz output with a compatible display, but they still target 60 FPS and 30 FPS respectively. To wrap things up, I thought I'd quickly compare the patched modes together. The quality mode and balance mode look very similar now, though the quality mode has higher settings for shadows, which is pretty obvious in this scene. But the quality mode and balance mode have a very similar Lumen GI presentation, with the performance mode appearing a little coarser. Then there are the expected image quality differences. The performance mode is visibly 1080p-like, while the quality and balance modes have greater clarity. Of these modes, I really think the 40 FPS balance mode at 120Hz is best. It has good input response, consistent frame pacing, and feels reasonably smooth. The quality mode is fine, though the hit to frame rate is a little steep, and the performance mode's frame gen is still a bit too much for my tastes. I might prefer a non-frame gen 60 FPS targeting mode though, if one was available. On PS5 Pro, let's start with the quality mode. The biggest change here is the introduction of PSSR, which works from roughly a 1296p input resolution typically, but produces a 4K-like final image. It's perceptibly sharper, especially during movement, and holds up really nicely on a 4K TV set. Some elements that weren't effectively anti-aliased with FSR are actually a bit cleaner here, like the noisy hair on the first boss and recently disoccluded detail in general, which tends to look a bit blurred instead of fizzly like with FSR. There is a bit of that signature PSSR noise if you look closely, though it's not obvious from normal viewing distances. I've turned off sharpening for my Pro comparisons, so you should be getting a good impression of the detail in the underlying image here. Despite the fact that we are looking at a UE5 game, the lighting is generally pretty stable and consistent here with PSSR, without Silent Hill 2-like shimmer, but the lighting here was already pretty stable with FSR, so perhaps that's just less of an issue in general for the content in this title. I did note some lumen changes again between the PS5 code and PS5 Pro, though these seemed more substantial than the tweaks I noted between the various PS5 versions. Performance is in line with the base console at a locked 30 frames per second in my tests, which feels alright on a controller with motion blur maxed. The balance mode is quite similar to quality mode, with a roughly 1296p typical internal res taken to 4K using PSSR. The most conspicuous visual difference here comes down to the shadows, which are higher res in the quality mode. The setup is pretty similar to the PS5 split then, with a fairly conservative upgrade for the 30 FPS targeting mode variant. There are some lumen tweaks here though that do mirror the quality mode a little bit as well. Frame rates hovering around 45 FPS are typical at 60Hz output, and the game delivers a more or less straight 40 FPS at 120Hz output. I'm not a fan of the way the game looks on a 60Hz panel in this mode, but at 120Hz, you get steady frame pacing and consistent controller response. The performance mode hasn't changed much. It's still a 60 FPS targeting mode using frame gen and still runs at a 1080p resolution. Compared side by side, it appears very similar to the old performance mode, minus some lumen discrepancies. This mode still appears to use FSR3 as well. It also performs very similarly to the base console performance mode. Again, we see the same procession of 33 millisecond frames if the camera position changes rapidly and non-linearly, suggesting frame gen may be turned off in these moments. It's unfortunate that this mode hasn't been substantially revised, because this is probably the mode on the base console that I find most lacking. Between the PS5 Pro's larger GPU and boosted CPU, I'd hope the resources would be there for a decent 60 FPS targeting mode without frame gen. Perhaps this is something game science can consider for a future update. I'm reasonably pleased with Black Myth Wukong's technical evolution on PS5 since launch, as both the quality and balance modes feel like they make reasonable trade-offs and can achieve stable frame rates. There are still some unusual elements in the mix, like frame gen at 60 FPS and 45 FPS frame rate targets at 60Hz, that do mar the game and make certain mode and refresh rate combinations difficult to use in my opinion. The Pro upgrade is on the conservative side, but it does represent a clear improvement from the base game. The quality and balance modes go from a 1440p-like image to a 4K-like one, with PSSR proving a nice upgrade for Pro users. There's no wild settings bump here or attempts at extra ray tracing, but the image quality does look clearly better in typical play, which is something we can't always say for Pro upgrades. So Black Myth Wukong has taken several steps in the right direction, even if I think a few configuration calls remain misguided. I'm pretty comfortable recommending the PS5 and Pro versions of the game now, just with a few caveats. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.